Welcome to the Woman's Connection. I'm Barry Louise Switson, your moderator. The Woman's Connection is a program about events shaping women's lives and helping one gain authentic power on a personal or professional level. So won't you stay tuned?
Did you ever say something flippantly, and the next thing you know, that's your new career? Well, that's what happened to our guest, and I would like to hear this interesting story and share it with you also. She has gone on to write 12 best-selling books, and I would like to welcome Leslie Carrol. Leslie, welcome.
Thank you, Barry.
Why don't you start and tell us what exactly happened with your flippant comment?
In 1998, I think summer of 1998, I was working 3 survival jobs. I have a background as a professional actress. I'm a member of SAG and AFTRA and Equity, and that, of course, no guarantees that you're going to get hired for anything. So I was working 3 survival jobs. 2 of them were secretarial, and one of them was as a news and feature writer and editor for the theatrical trade paper Backstage. And I was on my way out to the Hamptons, sitting in traffic on the Long Island Expressway with a friend of mine who is a fabulous writer and director, Mayor Ribolo. And I just kind of lamented to him, I'd like to write for a living. Because obviously if Backstage were paying me a living wage, I wouldn't have had 2 other jobs at the time. And he said, don't take this the wrong way, but you're such a romantic, you should really write romance novels.
And the rest is history?
And the rest is history. I had actually, I confess, I never read romance novels when I was coming up in the world. I thought a romance novel was Jane Austen or Jane Eyre. I didn't know that it was an actual genre, but I thought, well, heck, that's great. So I'm going to do that. And there I was out on the East End of Long Island, which has a very rich history to it of the whole whaling community. It was the first deep water port. George Washington made it such with the first Congress. Great Revolutionary War history, and I started writing an historical novel that's still in the desk drawer about actual people on the East End, but what it did was it jump-started a whole career, and I started writing contemporary fiction as well in what I laughingly refer to as my spare time, since I had 3 survival jobs at the time. But that was the summer of 1998, and by the spring of 1999, I had a literary agent, and from there, the rest is history.
How did you find a literary agent?
Through a friend of a friend. It's so much of my success has been attributed to social situations, like meeting you, for instance, in the locker room at the gym, of all places. It was at a birthday party, and I met a woman who was an editor at one of the top publishing houses here in New York. And she said, I told her I've started segueing from acting to writing, although I still haven't given up acting, but that I'd started a writing career, and would she be interested in reading any of my material? And she said, absolutely. Send me what you think is your best work. And I had a novel, a different historical novel that I was working on that took 6 years to get published, but it was a time travel that involved a contemporary actress cast as Jane Austen in a play, and she goes back in time serendipitously to Bath, England in 1801 and ends up meeting the actual Jane Austen. So I sent Ellen a few pages of the manuscript, I don't know, maybe 100 pages of the manuscript, maybe it was the whole thing, I don't recall. And I said, if you feel comfortable recommending a literary agent, then, who might be looking for new clients, then please do. And one thing I have learned is that it's great to everybody's got a story to tell, and it's great to write it. But I think if you're really serious about having a career in publishing, one of the first things you need to do is get an agent. It's very, very hard with the plethora of writers and the plethora of submissions out there. An agent is the good housekeeping seal of approval, and they will find the right editor to submit your manuscript to. So Ellen recommended 3 agents. I sent each of them what's called a query letter explaining who I was and what I'd written, and that I'd had Ellen's imprimatur. And one of them never responded. One of them said, actually, I'm not looking for clients. And the third one, who was the woman I ended up signing with, Irene Goodman, she said, sure, send me what you sent Ellen. And she fell in love with the piece, as rough and unfinished as it was, because of a bizarre connection. It was serendipity. I had a scene early on in the book where the character of my contemporary actress, C.J. Wells, goes to a country dance workshop down in Greenwich Village and is doing all of those dances that would have been done during Jane Austen's day. And I based that on my own life experiences. And Irene said to me, you know, I have a cousin that does those workshops. Where do you take it? And I said, 13th Street and 7th Avenue in Greenwich Village. And she said, wait a minute, my cousin runs them. And I said, is his name? And she said, yes. So it's because she had this connection to this one scene that went in and out and in and out of the manuscript as it went through its several revisions, that was the first connection, and that's what brought me into her office.
So that's what really solidified your getting a contract with an agent.
Yes.
That is so
Yes.
great. Life is full of serendipity.
Yeah, she had this personal connection to one of the scenes, and it turned out that we were talking about exactly the same person.
Fabulous. Well, what has been the most difficult part of this whole process for you, since everything just seems to be falling in place for you?
Art is a business. It's always a business, whether you're an actor or a painter or a writer. You can't just sit in your little ivory tower or your studio and make art and put it out into the world and expect that the baby will be a success. There are so many decision makers involved, and I couldn't possibly speak for authors who are household names, but for a writer in my position, even with 12 books published, it's always a constant struggle. You're almost always back at the bottom of the hill, and like Sisyphus, you are pushing that rock back up to get another contract, to get another book published. Publishing, I've found, is, even though it's been said that it's operating the same way the business did 150 years ago, or even 75 years ago when F. Scott Fitzgerald shared a picture of Manhattans with his editor in the Rose Room at the Algonquin. Books are no longer bought over booze and handshakes. It's a whole committee decision that goes on behind the scenes, and even if an editor likes your book, there's usually a whole committee of editors that needs to approve of it. It's almost like being on a reality TV show where all the judges have to vote for you if you want to get moved on. The editors' decisions are not purely artistic either. They might love your writing, but there's a whole sales and marketing force that's brought in, and they say, well, how are similar books selling? I think you'll appreciate this because it's very similar to the real estate market, where you want to buy an apartment and your realtor does her research and gives you comps. What similar properties are selling at what prices? So the whole editorial staff makes a determination based on the literary version of comps that come from their sales and marketing department and from the research of the different warehouses that ship the books. What's selling? What similar books sold to yours? What isn't selling? What, if you're writing historical fiction, what periods tend to be more commercial than other periods? And so a lot of decisions these days are based upon the way other people's books sold, as well as whether your own books have been flying off the shelves.
Being in real estate, I understand what you're saying about the comparable market analysis. I guess it transcends all markets here. You write in two forms. You write fiction and you write nonfiction, and you're also in two genres. So which one do you prefer?
3 genres if you count women's fiction, which is contemporary lit, set here in New York City where I grew up, and historical fiction, which is indeed written under my pen name, Amanda Elliott, E-L-Y-O-T, and now nonfiction. I prefer to be working, and I find that one genre tends to feed the other. Just as an actress it's just as much fun to do a contemporary comedy as it is to do Shakespeare or George Bernard Shaw, because it stretches different muscles. Although I started writing historical fiction, the first title that my agent sold was contemporary fiction, so it was sold under the name Leslie Carrol, which is the name that I write my contemporary fiction under, and which I now have my nonfiction published under. But now we're back to the vicissitudes and the arcana of the publishing business, which is all about branding. And when I got my first historical fiction contract in 2004, my contemporary fiction, that was with a different publisher, my contemporary fiction publishers had this sort of "does Macy's tell Gimbel's" reaction and said, well, she's going to change her name, isn't she? And not really being familiar with the fact that publishing, so much of publishing is about branding, I thought, well, wait a minute, if John Steinbeck had suddenly written a mystery back in 1953, wouldn't the PR department say, for those of you who love John Steinbeck's blah, 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 now he's gone into a new genre or is creating the same kind of dynamic characters? Oh, no, they wanted a whole new name.
How did you come up with the new name?
Amanda Elliott is based on the two principal characters of one of my favorite plays, which is Noel Coward's Private Lives. Amanda Prynne and Elliot Chase are the two principal characters, and I played Amanda, and she's one of my all-time favorite roles. I adore her. And I thought, well, that would be fun. It's kind of a nod. The people that knew that I'd performed a lot of Noel Coward, it'll be a little inside joke to them. And I was having dinner with a good friend of mine who had been my Elliot, in fact. And I said that I was going to write under this different name, and that's how Amanda was born.
Life just keeps moving. Which do you find more exciting, writing fiction or nonfiction?
I find each one of them to be a challenge. It's an incredible joy to be able to get up in the morning and brush my teeth and go into my home office and make stuff up for a living. And fiction is very exciting. But nonfiction, especially since I'm new to it, and my historical fiction editor, who also edited my nonfiction debut, which is called Royal Affairs, a lusty romp through the extramarital adventures that rocked the British monarchy, very titillating, and the subject matter really is. She wanted me to bring some of the skills that I use as a fiction storyteller to the entries on these scandalous affairs. And it was really a challenge to be able to have to do all the research, especially since I was only given 5 months to research and write the entire book. It was a brand new genre for me, and I found that exciting. And I found writing in a new style that combined the way that I write fiction, my fictional voice, with the journalistic style that I had honed it backstage. It's a lot of fun, and I have another contract now to do kind of a companion piece to Royal Affairs, which at the moment, the working title is Notorious Royal Marriages, or What's Love Got to Do with It, since so many of them were arranged.
What was the most striking bit of information that came out of doing your research for the Royal Affairs?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. One thing that I discovered, and it wasn't quite information, but it had to do with research, because I was only, because of time and budgetary constraints, I was limited to secondary source material, meaning other biographies that have been written over the decades. It was very interesting to find different facts across different biographies, and it was a hard decision to figure out, well, gee, which one is right, because several respected historical biographers often disagreed as to certain basic facts. So it was a tough call for me, because I'm neither an historian nor an academic, to figure out where the truth lies.
Your research, bearing all this in mind, how do you think women shaped history?
The Queen had a tougher time than everybody else, because she was really supposed to be little more than the well-dressed womb. And she had to keep herself chaste, and she had to produce the heir and a spare, which is how Anne Boleyn got herself into trouble, because she didn't produce a male heir, and Henry VIII desperately wanted one. I found in my research, especially of the numerous royal mistresses who are in royal affairs, that even though some of them may have been bad girls, and some of them may have been very greedy and grasping, what we might call a gold digger these days, many of them were women who were in the prime of life, who really made their own decisions. They weren't forced into any sort of liaison with the king or the prince, and some of them made the decision. They'd been career women before that. A couple of the mistresses, like Mary Robinson and Dorothy Jordan, had been professional actresses at the top of their career and gave up their profession to be a royal mistress, which is an amazing dichotomy when you think that being an actress in that day was considered incredibly unrespectable, but being a royal mistress, even if you happened to be also married, as Mary Robinson was, that was okay. But these women, the ones who had children by their royal lovers, King Charles II, who was known as the Merry Monarch for his myriad involvements, never had a legitimate child. He had 17 royal bastards by numerous mistresses, and he ennobled most of them, which meant that he elevated them to the peerage, so they were dukes and earls. Those boys grew up to be the men who sat in the House of Lords, the parliamentarians who shaped English history. So even though their mothers might have made some interesting choices along the way, their children were the ones that really helped shape the history of the realm. And that's fascinating, and I think it's incredibly powerful.
How do you see the parallels between women then and women today as far as what's going on with the monarchy?
What Royal Affairs charts a shift between an absolute monarchy where if you didn't do what the king said, off with her head, to a constitutional monarchy where there are ostensibly a lot more choices. But ostensibly, I say, because even if you look at the marriage between Prince Charles and Princess Diana, which took place in our lifetime in the summer of 1981, it was still an arranged marriage. And the Windsors, the royal house, the ruling house of England, was still thinking, they're still operating on a centuries-old mindset where the heir to the throne, Charles, had to marry a virgin, and he had to marry a woman who came of noble blood. And so they chose Diana, even though he had had liaisons before with other women, and he had been passionately in love with Camilla Parker Bowles. And it's sad. If they had allowed him to marry Camilla, who he'd met in the early 1970s and became involved with, even though she was a commoner, she'd gone to a good school. She went to a Swiss boarding school. The two of them shared much in common, but she wasn't from a noble family, as Princess Diana was. Princess Diana, who was Lady Diana Spencer, could trace her lineage centuries back to noble families. Camilla wasn't considered good enough. So I think so much heartbreak could have been avoided if the royal family had, even in the 1980s, been in step with what the rest of the world was doing.
This sounds so much like what happened to Princess Margaret and, what was his name, Lord Townsend, and the
Group Captain Peter Townsend. I'm less familiar with Princess Margaret's story. I wish I had put her in Royal Affairs, but I had a page count, and because the subtitle is the extramarital adventures that rocked the British monarchy, I really had to cherry pick ones that had a lasting effect, really changed. And there weren't just sex scandals, that really changed the shape of England or the monarchy itself, like Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII. Arguably, Anne Boleyn is one of the most influential people on the Christian religion since Jesus Christ, because there would have been no Anglican church in England. Henry would not have broken with the Catholic Church if Anne had not introduced him to the writings of Martin Luther and steered him in that direction.
When Edward VIII gave up the crown for Wallace, how did that shape history and what was behind that?
It's a fascinating story because on the surface you have the heart-rending story of the king who gave up all for love, which is the title of one of my historical fiction books about another royal mistress who's in royal affairs, Mary Robinson. But Edward VIII ostensibly gave up all for love to marry the woman that he wanted to. She was a twice divorced American named Wallis Simpson, who grew up in a lower middle class house in Baltimore. At one point her mother had run a boarding house to make ends meet. He fell in love with Wally, who was married at the time. Wally ended up getting one of those marvelous divorces where a scandal is arranged so her husband got caught in flagrante in a hotel room with a woman. It was a setup, but so that she could get her divorce. She actually had said to him, if you have to give up your crown for me, don't do that. I'll just be a royal mistress. As long as you, which is incredible because it's exactly the opposite of what Anne Boleyn said to Henry, which is, I will not be a royal mistress, I will be your wife, or I will be nothing. We're not even going to have any nookie until I'm Mrs. Queen. Wally said, I'm content with the status quo. If you have to give up your crown, as long as you don't marry anybody else, that would break my heart. But if we can continue the way we've been, then that's okay with me because I don't want you to make such a sacrifice. Edward said, absolutely not. I'm going to do this right. I want to be married. And what was transpiring behind the scenes were these fascinating machinations. The prime minister at the time was very concerned with Edward's pro-Nazi sympathies. And this is 1936, and of course you know what's happening in Germany at the time. Hitler is on the rise, and it doesn't look pretty for most of Western Europe. And Edward's politics were becoming a large problem for the parliamentarians, even though he was a constitutional monarch who really couldn't shape government. He was still the king. He was, however, very popular with the common Englishman, what John Bull, a nickname of the common man, just like we say John Doe here. He was a hero to the Welsh miners. He had served in World War I. Although it was in a non-combat position, he had still been in the military, and so former servicemen who had come back saw him as one of their own. And Parliament decided to explain to Edward that if he insisted on marrying Wallis Simpson, he would get a vote of no confidence from his cabinet, which would walk out en masse, and that would be a nightmare to, reconstitute a government. Plus the fact that his people were against it and would never conscience him marrying this twice-divorced American. Plus the fact that England was an empire, and she had other dominions, Ireland, and Australia, and New Zealand, and that every one of those, the parliaments in every one of those dominions would also have to convene and vote whether it was all right for the king to choose to marry this woman. Well, as it turned out, the hitch was not that Wallis was divorced or that she was American. There's nothing in England's constitution that prohibits a marriage between the king and anybody who's divorced or anybody that's not British. In fact, most queen consorts were not British. There were only a couple that were British born. The trick was that her two ex-husbands still lived, and that's something that's since been changed. Anyway, they decided that because of Edward's Nazi sympathies that they told him there was no way he could marry Wallis. So he could either marry Wallis or he could abdicate. And he chose the latter, of course, very famously, and got a lot of flack for that. But can you imagine what sort of world we would still be living in if Edward had married Wallace and the two of them had allowed their acquaintanceship, and they did have a personal acquaintanceship with Hitler and Goebbels, allow that to flourish. What would have happened to England? What would have happened to Western Europe? What might have even happened to America if his reign had continued? So we live in a very, very different world because he abdicated.
E-books. How do you see that affecting the authors and the residuals and making money?
The contracts that an author gets cover ebooks. The publisher gets the lion's share of the money. I don't know about people who self-publish because that's not the world that I've ever been a part of. But when an author gets a book contract, you sign away many of the rights to publish in all sorts of different formats, which includes ebooks. And there's a clause, that basically covers any sort of technology that may ever be invented in perpetuity. So it is still the publisher that gets the lion's share of it. But with the new media, whatever it may be, it certainly gives authors the opportunity to be out there in many, many formats. And if readers prefer to carry an ebook device or to print out the copy on their own or to purchase the book in the store or to buy a recorded version of the book and listen to it in their car on the way to work or during a vacation, I think that's all to the good. It just gives authors that many more opportunities for their work to be read and enjoyed.
Leslie, it's been wonderful having you here. What would you like to leave the audience with?
If I had one wish, I would say read a book. If you read one book last year, read two. If you read two, read four. Experiment. Allow your imagination's muscles to stretch. Take a break from reality TV. Save that gas money and curl up in an armchair with the fantastical sensory experience of holding a book.
Leslie, Carrol, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been wonderful learning about how you got into the business and you redirected your career, once again, like all of us. Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions for Leslie, write us here at the Women's Connection.
Absolutely.
Yes, she'd be delighted to answer them for you. Bye now.